Welcome, everyone. We are honored to have Rabbi Ike Serotta this evening help us prepare our hearts, minds, and soul for the high holy days. I could give you his, his whole resume, but you can also check at mymakom.org. And if you haven't made your community commitment or gotten your high holiday stuff, it's all on the website. Okay, Rabbi Serotta, take it away.
Welcome, everybody. It's nice to be with you. And I want to share some things tonight, really some of the things that I've been thinking about as I prepare for these high holy days. And certainly there's room for discussion and conversation. But I'm going to focus a lot on one particular prayer that is kind of the heart of the liturgy for me. And it presents one of the most difficult parts of the liturgy in some ways. Really sort of, in some ways, it really goes against the way we usually think about God, I think. So this is the Unatana Tokef prayer, which is the one that, who will live and who will die, right? And I've been thinking a lot about that prayer, and I think some of you know I just actually spent some time in Alaska. We took a little vacation and had a fantastic time. It's an amazing place to visit. We are among the lucky 30% that actually got to see Denali, which some of you who traveled there, is it is the tallest mountain in the world. There's a bit of a technicality here. It's not the highest mountain in the world, but it is the tallest, right? Because in the Himalayas, the mountains like Everest and K2, they start at a higher elevation, so the actual climb is shorter. Since Denali starts near sea level and goes up 20,000 feet and something, it makes it the longest climb, so the tallest mountain, but not the highest peak in the world. So, most of the time it's shrouded in clouds. It kind of makes its own weather system. And so we were lucky enough to be among the, they say 30%, only 30% of people who travel to Alaska actually get to see Denali. So, so we felt very blessed. And I listened to traveling to Alaska felt a bit like a pilgrimage, almost like a pilgrimage to Israel or someplace like that. We went there in some ways, certainly to enjoy it, but also to bear witness to it, to see what's going on there. And climate change is very much in your face in Alaska, even more so than it is here, I think. So, and while we were there, the UN climate report was released, and some of you probably followed a little bit of that in the news. We actually didn't see very much of it in the news because we were traveling, but heard about it more when we came back. But if you don't know about it, the UN climate report is a compilation from thousands and thousands and thousands of scientific studies, all of which show that human activity is causing climate change. And the Secretary General of the UN called it Code Red for humanity. So in the past, when I've thought about this prayer, Unatana Tokef, I think we often talk about it in terms of metaphor. I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. So we talk about metaphor, and now with climate change upon us, I'm not so sure that it's a metaphor anymore, right? And when you read these words, when I read these words now, and I read who by fire and who by water, we're certainly talking about 500,000 acres on fire, I think, in the Western United States, and people certainly dying from fire. In Alaska, you have the glaciers are melting. And of course, the glaciers are supposed to melt. The glaciers have been melting since the end of the last ice age, but they're not supposed to melt at the rate that they've been melting. And when you're there in Alaska, they actually have these sort of posts in the ground that tell you the year and where the glacier was in that year. And so that you can see that the glacier is melting 10 times as fast as it was just 20 years ago. So it's moving very quickly, and so these things will cause the sea level to rise. In addition to the glaciers melting, the permafrost is melting. The ice cap is melting, and so all of those things are happening. And so who by fire and who by water is not a metaphor anymore. Perhaps when the prayer was first written, it wasn't a metaphor either. But for a large part of the 20th century, I think we were able to read it that way. And who by war and who by beast, of course, we know there is war and unrest raging around the world. But the beast thing as well, because one of the things that climate change is doing is it changes the habitat of animals, and it's bringing humans and animals, humans and bears, for example, closer and closer together. And if the bears start to associate the smell of food with the smell of human, we're going to have some significant trouble with that as well. So, and of course, famine and drought, earthquake and plague, right? I mean, this is the world we are living in right now. So it's no longer, sort of metaphorical terms. People have written it in different ways, likening the beast to, the beast within ourselves and things like that, and maybe it's that too, but these things have become quite literal, it seems to me. So the answer that the prayer gives us is it tells us that teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah can avert the harshness of the decree. And and so again, thinking about climate change in the world, we're past the point of saying we can solve the problem. And we're actually past the point of saying that we can go back to the way things were. Now it is a question of averting the harshness of the decree, or if I can pun on this, the harshness of the degree. So we have a pretty small margin, a couple of degrees, less than 2 degrees centigrade, make the difference between a livable planet and one that is not livable for human beings. And that's why the UN report calls it Code Red for humanity. So I want to talk about what we can do to avert the harshness of the decree and what these words might mean for us this year and perhaps going forward, teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah. And I think these words are all interesting in Jewish tradition. They carry a lot of weight and meaning. We might start by saying that why these three? There are other words, right? We could. Why did the authors of this prayer, and by the way, there's some mythology about where this prayer comes from, but its origins are a bit mysterious. We don't know exactly when Jews started saying this, but when did they start saying teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, right? Because there are certainly other things like what's not in this list that might seem obvious, mitzvot, for example, commandments, we're told we're supposed to live by the mitzvot, 613 commandments. Well, one might think that doing the mitzvot would be the answer, or one of the ways to avert the decree, or the study of Torah, right? Talmud Torah. In the Talmud, it actually tells us, it gives us this list of mitzvot that we're supposed to do, and then says, and Talmud Torah keneged kulam. Talmud Torah, the study of Torah is equal to all of them, right? So, and what about, I see members of our Tikkun Olam committee here. Why not that, right? How is it that we arrived at these terms? And there are certainly other choices. If you looked at the Musar literature, you might think about other words that you might use, right? Perhaps shalom, for example, peace. Right? But so these things have been chosen very particularly. And so I think that's interesting in of itself. Right? Um, so why these? So teshuvah literally means to turn toward God. Right? Um, this in our tradition, how do we do this? We do it through apology, remorse, restitution. I want to suggest this is something I learned from one of my teachers, and some of you on the call may actually have met him and know him, Rabbi Larry Kushner, Lawrence Kushner, who was actually once employed at Congregation Solel in Highland Park back in the 1960s. It was his first job, I think, out of rabbinic school. So, but he was one of my teachers at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. He used to fly in from Boston to teach the rabbinic students once a week. And he talked about these terms in a very specific way. He says the thing that all three of these have in common is that they require a diminution. I hope I said that right. A diminution of the ego. Right. So when we turn to God, right, it's every return makes us less. Another great scholar, Rabbi Adenstein, says about it: a person turns himself about, away from the pursuit of what he craves, and confronts his desire to approach God. So this turning, this teshuvah, is always turning from something that we want, something that we like, something that we enjoy, and back toward God, right? Because if we didn't enjoy whatever the transgression was, we wouldn't be doing it in the first place, right? So in this context of climate crisis, right? I mean, these comforts that we have to give up some of it. We have to turn away from some of it, make ourselves smaller. So we'd say in green circles, we'd say reduce our carbon footprint, right? And that's turning, perhaps, in this context. Tefillah has a similar sense of making our ego smaller. In any genuine prayer, we give ourselves back to God. Right? Abraham Joshua Heschel put it poetically: to worship God is to forget the self. In prayer, we shift the center of living from self-consciousness to self-surrender. We even turn our own power of speech over to God, right? What's that first line in the tefillah? Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise, right? So we even ask God to give us the words so that we can give them back. So it's in tefillah, we're talking about not what we want, but what God wants, right? And then the third, tzedakah, of course, is also a diminution, right? If we think of it, I mean, it comes from the root for tzedek, which means righteousness or justice. So used as tzedakah, it means righteous giving or just giving, right? So it's not just, it's often translated as charity, and that's not quite right. I mean, because first of all, in a Jewish context, tzedakah is not voluntary. It's required. It is one of the mitzvot. It's something that we're supposed to do. And when they say in English, give till it hurts, right? That's what tzedakah should be in our tradition, right? So if you do give till it hurts, then in fact, you are again causing this diminution of yourself, right, to make room for something else. So again, Larry Kushner says it's like in the old westerns, there ain't room in this town for the both of us, right? not God and your ego. And so you have to make the ego smaller so that there's room for God. And so, so I think that that's the connection of these three, right, is this sense that all of them are about reducing our ego. And if you like, in this metaphor I'm weaving about climate change, reducing our carbon footprint in a variety of different ways. So if teshuvah means change, then, from turning, so in small ways and large ways, we need to change. We can reduce our consumption, which is the best thing. We're pretty good at recycling. We're not necessarily very good at reusing, right? I mean, things that we just throw it away and get a new one, right? It's one of the things we do at Rosh Hashanah is tashlich, right? The casting out of sins, and maybe that metaphor is something that we have to think about a little bit more, because we're so used to just casting things away, old refrigerators and dishwashers and computers and all this stuff that is planned to go bad, and how few of those things. Our stove broke a few years ago, and we called a repair person, and the repair person came to the house and said it's cheaper to buy a new stove. Okay? And that's the world that we have created, right? That it's hard to change that back into a world where something can be rehabilitated and reused. So whatever we do, we need to start making some change. So we do tashlich, but we say a prayer in the High Holy Days, Al tashlichenu, do not cast us out, right? I can almost imagine my appliances saying it to me, don't cast us out when we get old, figure out some way to keep using us, right? And that's easier said than done in the modern world, but I love that thought of these inanimate objects that we so easily toss aside, calling to us and saying, don't cast us away. Don't throw us out. In fact, this year we're going to have a reverse tashlich. So I'll say more about that right at the end. But in addition to throwing away our sins in a environmentally conscious way this year, we're also going to participate in a coastal cleanup, so that we can actually pull sins out of the water and clean up after ourselves. So we have to turn. And then tzedakah, of course, there are plenty of organizations to give to that are working on climate change issues. There are some wonderful Jewish organizations like Hazon, which I'll talk about and give you a link to at the very end. But there are plenty of other, more secular organizations also working on this. And but I just want to say we have to go a step farther. Right? It's time for governments to pony up, and that's one of the things that we're talking about in the infrastructure bill, the one that's working its way through Congress now, and the big one that will probably come up through reconciliation, and we'll need all 50 votes of the Democratic side, because it doesn't seem to be clear that there'll be any votes from the Republican side of the aisle, unfortunately. There is, I think, if it's clear to all the members of the Senate that it's going to pass, that there might be a few surprises, and I hope that happens. Again, talking about our time in Alaska, we talked to a lot of Alaskans. It is generally a red state. About 70% of the population votes Republican, but everybody we talked to was concerned about climate change. Even the guy who immediately told us how much he hates Lori Lightfoot, even though he hasn't been to Chicago in 30 years, was talking about climate change and that government needs to do something about it. So it's possible, I think, that a senator like Lisa Murkowski might actually vote with the majority once it's clear that there is a majority. So we'll see. Excuse me. But so tzedakah has to, at this point, really be not just our personal righteous giving, but this real sense of justice, that we have to do justice for the earth, that we can't just kick it down the road anymore. So I think that's something really to think about. And then I want to mention tefillah as well, and what this means in the context of this. Because prayer certainly has value, but words are obviously not enough in this situation. We can't ask God to fix this problem. So we avert the severe decree, the harshness of the decree, only when we act. So we have to think about things like when Rabbi Heschel marched with Dr. King on Shabbat in Selma, and some people criticized him. You know the famous line, right? He was criticized. How could you, a devoted religious Jew, march on Shabbat? And he said, I was praying with my feet, right? So prayer is not just sitting back. Prayer is working in partnership with God. So taking steps to heal the world. So I did want to bring you this message that's not in our Machzor, not in our High Holy Day prayer book, but this saying from the sayings of our ancestors, the Pirkei Avot, sayings that are about 2,000 years old or so. This is Rabbi Tarfon, and this is probably the most famous thing that he said, and I think it speaks to our moment quite a bit. The day is short, the work is great, the laborers are sluggish, and the reward is much, and the master is urgent, right? So if we apply that to climate change as well, we recognize that there's a lot to be done. We don't have much time to do it. Up till now, we human beings have been at best sluggish when it comes to this. There is obviously reward for this for the generations that come after us. And the master you can define any way you want. You can define it as God, letting us know that this has to be done, or nature, or the world, or however you think of it, right? So a lot of different ways to think about it, I think, but an important text for us. So, and I think I have one more slide for you, which comes from near the end of the Unatana Tokef. And this little poetic section has always intrigued me, because it seems to me like there's one thing in this list that isn't like the others. There's a lot of natural imagery here: withered grass, flowers that fade, shadows moving on, right? Cloud passing by, dust on the wind, a dream that flies away. But that first one, broken vessels, strikes me. And this is an interesting term in Jewish tradition. I mean, we can talk about the mystical elements of broken vessels in a little bit, if you like. But a vessel is clearly something of human design, and when it breaks, it causes a problem, right? And so this one suggests to me that again, putting into this context of climate change, and say we've broken it, right? So that the grass is withering that isn't supposed to wither, the flower is fading before it's supposed to. All of these things are happening in the ways they're happening because we have broken it, right? So that broken vessel takes on a different context. And I want to mention there's a midrash on this phrase, right? It says in Yalkut Shimoni, which is a collection of midrash that's 1,800 years old, something like that. So if one dreams of a vessel, one should expect peace. And so what does a vessel have to do with peace? It says two of the things in the world that are most opposite to each other are water and fire. Right? They can't exist together in the same place, right? So either the water will extinguish the fire, or the fire will evaporate the water, right? So either way, right, they are forces that are at war, fire and water. But if you put a vessel between them, right, then then they can both exist side by side, right? So you can boil the water for coffee or tea or soup or whatever you're making, right? So the vessel is actually the thing that allows the opposites in the world to exist. So this is kind of a basic idea of tikkun olam. We are repairing the broken vessel. And so we have to repair the broken vessel of the earth. And so the vessel itself symbolizes peace, right? The thing that can bring opposites together in a way that they can coexist. So that's part of our goal, ultimately, is to do that. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see each other and talk, and we'll come back to that link to Hazon in a little bit. But I'm interested to hear any thoughts or questions about Unatan Tokef, or honestly anything else that's on your mind for the High Holy Days. But that's basically that's an article that I've been writing about Alaska and the environment and Unatan Tokef. So it's certainly what's been on my mind as I'm preparing for the Holy Days. I don't think it's one of my sermons for the Holy Days, so you won't have to hear a rerun of that. Unfortunately, there's too much to preach about this year. It'd be nice to have a quiet year and not much going on, so that you can, you don't feel compelled to preach about things. Any thoughts? Any questions? Anything about it in Unatan Tokef or anything? Sarah?
I put Hazon in the chat so people can click on it.
Yeah.
And Sarah, did you want to say something? You need to unmute.
Yeah. The last reading that you put up there with the withered grass and the flowers fading, I always thought that was about the temporary nature of everything, that change is always happening, that nothing lasts forever, that things are of a finite lifespan, as part of the human condition. So I was quite interested that you interpreted that in a different way.
Yeah, and you're certainly not wrong to interpret it that way. And the prophet Isaiah uses almost the same language. We often read it at funerals, that we're like grass that in the morning rises anew and in the evening fades and withers, right? So surely the people are like grass, Isaiah says, and so it's absolutely part of the understanding of Unatan Tokef is, everything has a natural lifespan. And again, though, I think it's interesting. The vessel, the shattered vessel, is a little different, right? It's like a different metaphor entirely. I'm sort of stuck into this list, right? So, because first of all, it's a thing that's created by human beings. God doesn't make the vessel. And well, in the mystical story of creation, we could talk about that if you want. But, we make the vessel and we also break the vessel, right? So it's an interesting thing that gives us this other little piece besides just the natural life of something. Yeah, Amy.
Vessel represent the contrast. We have to be aware of contrast. We have to have one without the other. So how does the vessel play a role in how we can be proactive in starting to heal the world. Because what is our responsibility? It seems tremendous. And how do we even tackle repairing that vessel?
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the hardest things about the climate crisis certainly is just getting your head around it, right? I mean, that's why we're so good at recycling. I mean, most of us are really good at recycling, because we can get our head around it, and we're getting better at some of these things, like stopping using single-use bottles and that kind of stuff. So people are getting better at some of these things. But unfortunately, none of those things will make the ultimate difference. It's really going to be governments making changes, right? And so it's really, because neither you nor I alone can. Well, I really care about the mileage, the mileage standards, right? Well, great. So you and I will work on that. We'll get a more efficient car or whatever. But until the whole world is using that standard of efficiency, and in a sense, we get to the point where we don't need the car, then something really happens, right? So much of this is really dependent on everybody, people like us, but certainly the next generation, the Gretas of the world, to shame governments into actually doing something, right? And perhaps, it's why it's such a shame, as with, getting vaccinations. It's such a shame when these things become the political thing where it's, one party against the other party, right? There's plenty of debate still to be had about what particular thing, what's the best thing to tackle and in what order and all that. That's all. There's obviously room for discussions and politics there, but as long as we have parties where one says this is a problem, the other says this is not a problem, we have to get past that point, right? And I felt in Alaska, like Alaska is past that point, right? The people I talked to in Alaska who generally vote for Republicans say, our Republican leaders have to do something about this, right? Now, that may not sink in the lower 48, as they call us, right? But it really does. Talk to a guy up there who is very, clearly he's very conservative politically. One of the things he does is rehab houses and flip them, right? Well, he's working on a house that sank into the ground because the permafrost melted, right? So he's going to lose his investment because he can't keep the house from, melting into the ground, right? So he's ready for change, right? But it can't be something he does all by himself.
Rabbi, when you said that you're, per vote, I thought you were going to bring up Lo Alecha. And Amy, this is one of my favorites. I just quickly Googled it, but it is not your duty to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. And then the next one is, may the Holy Temple be rebuilt speedily in our days. I didn't mean for that to come up, but we have to at least start it. We may not complete it, but we have to do this work.
Yeah, and I love that one, of course, and the song that goes with it and everything else. I do sometimes worry that we let ourselves a little bit off the hook, right? Like, yeah. I'm doing my part, I'm recycling.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And we have to, we have to go farther. We have to, right. Like anytime you use a metaphor these days, it has meaning. We have to hold politicians' feet to the fire.
Absolutely.
You know,
I'm
and
Jill, go ahead
there's
and then
plenty of fire
Sarah.
to go around at the moment.
Isn't that also from Pirkei Avot? If not now, when?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's Rabbi Hillel says that.
Yep.
And clearly, you know, like, when doesn't that apply? But it really applies, you know, because when this report came out on the 9th, and we're talking about code red for humanity, you know how it has to happen now, right? And so this, you know, these trillions that need to be spent. You know, and there isn't much of an argument against it, frankly.
Sarah, go ahead. You need to unmute.
I had a comment about the earlier slide you showed about Teshuvah, Tzedakah, and Tefillah being able to mitigate the punishment. Those are all things in a way that require sacrifice from us, as you said, diminishing us, but really are also kind of metaphors for or modern substitutions for the sacrifices at the temple.
Yeah.
Because I think the idea of the sacrifices at the temple were to get favor from God. I mean, to mitigate punishment or to gain favor. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, and that of course is where this prayer has been sort of a stumbling block for us, right? Because we know that we don't control God, right? And so the idea that there's sort of like you say the right prayer, you know, or make the right sacrifice, as our ancestors would have said, and therefore everything goes well with us, right? I think it's interesting that the phrase in Hebrew does not say it annuls the decree, right? It tempers the decree. And I think that's very interesting in the climate change discussion, but it's interesting in general, right? That even as we say this prayer, we know that bad things happen to good people. And so you can't completely change this decree. It's actually quoted in the new Machzor that we use. I think it's, let me see if I have that in front of me. Let me see if I can find the, I actually really like it and read it. It's one of the study texts for Unatana Tokef. Yeah, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who was born in, he's just a few years older than I am. This is what he says about, you know, this who by fire and who by water. He says, I sat in shul for years reading these words before I realized the answer to each of these questions is me. Who will live and who will die? I will. Who at their end and who not at their end? Me. Like every human being, when I die, it will be at the right time and it will also be too soon.
That's really good.
Yeah.
For years, I mean, for the last couple of years before my parents passed, when I would be in holiday services and hear this prayer, the Unatana Tokev, it would just resonate so deeply with me because I would always think, is this the year they're going to go? Will they be gone next year?
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of us think about it in terms of loved ones, and when it comes to ourselves, we would prefer to think about somebody else. You know.
Well, except that, you know, having survived a cancer scare, when you read that prayer, it's just a different. It's really difficult. It was very difficult for me. You know, I'm a few years out of that, but I can't stand reading that prayer.
Yeah. But that's so to finish what Ed Feinstein says about it. He says, this is the central truth of the High Holy Days. This is what makes them Yanim Noraim, days of terror. Right? We are vulnerable. And you know, most of us prefer to ignore that, you know, until, you know, you have an experience, Vanessa, that you can't ignore it, right?
Exactly.
You know, and I'm not sure if over a period of time of being healthy as human beings, we start ignoring that stuff again or not. you know, I mean, we learn to live with it, right? We learn
Yeah.
to live with the vulnerability.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not to be glib about that, because that's a,
Yeah.
you know,
I get it. Laura has her hand up.
I was really struck by your interpretation of the Unetana Tokev, taking it so literally, because I've never thought of it like that. And for you to just so clearly point out that that is reality,
Right.
I thought was so striking, because last week in the weekly Musar class that Macomb has, we were talking about Torah and how, you know, some of it just seems so unrelatable. You know, oh, that was such a long time ago, and things are so different now, you know, and we came to the conclusion that the challenge is always to, you know, to relate and to find things in that, because there's so much to find. But I do tend to think of, you know, these ancient times, the times of, you know, the Noah's Ark story and things like that, is, oh, well, that was then and this is now, and that's so far away, and oh my gosh, I can't believe people lived like that, you know, and that kind of thing. And it really connects, I think, connects me to all of that history, whether it be myth or not, you know, this idea of, oh wow, this is relevant, you know, this is here.
yeah. And I think there was a generation where we read this as metaphor, you know, who will be tormented by the fire of, you know, of anger, right? And, you know, stuff like that. And so we would take each of these things and sort of make them a kind of a metaphor for our own troubles, our own dissatisfactions, you know, things like that. But I think when it was written, it was pretty literal, you know. I mean, it's only 100 and some years ago that the city of Chicago burned down, you know, right? To people of that generation, a fire was a destructive force that, you know, now amazingly, right, I don't think anybody died in the Chicago fire. It's kind of an amazing statistic. The very same night there was a fire in Chicago, by the way, there was a fire in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. And more people died in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, many more than died in Chicago. Partly because all of the equipment, even equipment from as far as Milwaukee, was heading towards Chicago. Right?
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Sandy, go ahead.
When I face the holidays and I think of Rosh Hashanah, and I love the prayers and being together and everything, there's just one part that just makes me crazy. And that's the part where God tells the Father to take his son up and make him a sacrifice. And in the last 5 or 10 years at services, I make that my call. I must go to the washroom then. And I just walk out. I walk out. I cannot bear people reading that story. It's too painful to me to think that any parent, even with our love of God or belief in God, could follow an order like that.
Yeah.
And so that's my personal way of handling that.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
I think
We're
most
easier on
parents would
Zoom.
sacrifice themselves instead.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, it's a little easier, you know, online, because you don't have to trip anybody's feet when you're going to the bathroom. So that actually works. You can also just turn down the sound if you're watching it, right? Yeah, look, there are a lot of troubling stories in the Torah. The fact that we read it on Rosh Hashanah is one of the things that I, you know, if it just comes up in the annual cycle of reading, you know, then we sort of understand, well, we have to read everything, you know, we're going page by page, you know, we got to read the one about skin disease from the book of Leviticus, you know, so we got to read the one where Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain, you know, but the fact that it became the reading for the High Holy Days is very interesting. And again, I'm not sure that we know exactly why. By the way, it's not the reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. traditionally.
Mm.
Right. Some of you probably know that. I mean, Rosh Hashanah is different from the other holidays. You know, the other holidays that were decreed by the rabbis to have 2 days, that was a concession to a calendar problem. But the reason Rosh Hashanah had 2 days, Rosh Hashanah had 2 days even before, even before the diaspora, right? In fact, in the Talmud, it actually says that Rosh Hashanah is not 2 days; it's Yom Arichta, which is Aramaic for a long day, right? It's a 48-hour day, Rosh Hashanah. And in the first 24 hours of the 48, we actually read Genesis chapter 21. And then on the second day, we read Genesis chapter 22. And the Reform movement, when it decided to get rid of the second day of all those other holidays that had been decreed by the rabbis, said sort of threw out the baby with the bathwater and stopped really doing 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. So, and we lost something actually by doing that. And now, we'll have however many hundreds on the first day, and then usually dozens on the second, right? Now that we're trying to bring it back. And, we're not quite ready to go back and read chapter 21 on the first day and then chapter 22 to the dozens on the second day. But there's a lot in chapter 21 that's worth reading and also troubling. And you might also want to go to the bathroom, Sandy, when we're reading chapter 21, because that's where Abraham casts out Hagar and her son Ishmael.
Agreed.
Yeah, so there's a lot of dysfunctional families in Genesis, right? I think that's, I'll never, ever, you'll never catch me defending Abraham, that's for sure. But I do think the dysfunctional families in Genesis help us understand the dysfunction in families today, right? And recognize that even our ancestors who we hold up as role models had their foibles and troubles and mistakes and dysfunctions. And so we can forgive ourselves some of the mistakes that we make in life because of, we may not be Abraham, but, we didn't take our son up to be a sacrifice.
But aren't we allowed to appeal to God? Aren't we allowed to argue, or appeal is a nicer word?
Right. Well, that's what you see in the story, right? Is that now, as you read that story, you think Abraham sort of quietly acquiesces to taking his son up the mountain. And then, is it a couple of chapters later when we get to Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham is arguing, right? What if I find 50 righteous people? Would you save Sodom and Gomorrah? So if Abraham could argue there, why couldn't he argue, when it came to the Akedah? There is in Rashi, there's a little bit, it's probably to try and soften the trouble that we have with this story, is that Rashi looks at this phrase in the Torah where it says, take your son, your only one, the one you love, Isaac, and make him a sacrifice. And Rashi asks, why does the sentence go like that? And imagines, and I think this may appear in Midrash somewhere too, and Rashi's quoting it. He says he imagines this conversation with God, where God says to Abraham, take your son. And Abraham says, I have 2 sons. And God says, your only son. He says, well, each of them is the only son of his mother, right? The one you love. And Abraham says, I love them both. They're both my sons. And God finally has to say, Isaac, that's the one I mean, right? So Rashi suggests that Abraham is maybe not quite so compliant as he appears, that he's trying to tip the scales a little bit there with that, but it's not enough.
Right. Nancy, did you have something? And then Sarah.
Yeah, I had a thought, but it has since been superseded by all the other thoughts around me. And I think the main thing is that I know that my children who have grandchildren do worry about these issues.
Yeah.
And we have bequeathed them to them in terms of the future of our planet. And it's not just sort of esoteric. When I was growing up, it was kind of like, oh, what's this about? We had to twist ourselves in pretzels to figure out what it was about. Now we know. And this is, maybe it's always been this way and we just denied it.
Yeah.
So
Well, look, if I was going to preach about the binding of Isaac this year, I would probably Leonard Cohen actually on one of his first albums wrote a song, "The Story of Isaac." It was actually an anti-Vietnam War song, but the last, I mean, really just tells the story, and then at the end, it speaks to the listeners in a way, and it says, "You who build these altars now to sacrifice these children, you must not do that anymore. You never have been tempted by a demon or a god, right? You're just doing it for yourself, essentially." All right. And so that's the way to read the story right now, is that, yeah, I worry about my children. We met in Alaska, they use little propeller airplanes the way we use Uber, so we met a pilot, and he said he was glad he's old enough that he won't be around to see what happens to the environment, right? Which is, it's very sad and it's very telling, but it's also a guy who's never married, never had kids, right? Doesn't have any grandchildren. So he's not worried about them. He's just glad he won't be there,
That is sad. All right, Sarah, I know you had your hand up, and I'm just warning everyone that we have to end. We have a hard end at 8 o'clock.
Okay, I just had a quick comment about the binding of Isaac. The one solace that I get from that story is the way it ends, because I kind of see it as a transition from, in the historical context was that peoples around us were sacrificing, doing human sacrifices to appease their gods. And the overall outcome of the story means that God does not wish us to make human sacrifices to please him, because Isaac was spared and the ram was substituted for Isaac. So I see this kind of as a transitional message from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice as a means of worship, and as actually a progress in terms of the human way of practicing religion.
That's certainly one of the ways to read the story. I mean, we don't actually have evidence of human sacrifice among any of the Canaanite tribes, is my understanding. But
I don't mean our people, but I mean a lot of the surrounding people, certainly people at that time. I mean, virgins were sacrificed to appease the gods in some cultures, and there were cultures that were doing human sacrifice.
Right. I'm not sure there were in the Near East near the Canaanites, but
at that time.
Yeah. But my thought about it is, I'd say, if I didn't say it clearly enough a minute ago, we are sacrificing our children all the time. Right. And God didn't even ask us. Right. So that's where we have to go. So I do want to mention Hazon. This Jewish organization, in part because it gives us a little hope. There, Hazon, which means vision, and in fact, I think the word may appear in, not exactly in the Akedah. I mean, there I think it's year A. On the Mount of the Lord, there's vision, but Hazon is another word for vision, and they've created something called Brit Hazon, which is the covenant of vision, if you like, a commitment to change. And so that was I think, Vanessa, you got that into the chat?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'll just hit this very, very quickly, because you have 2 more minutes. This is what it looks like. And it looks like a very interesting website.
can you see the actual Brit Hazon on there? Does that?
Okay, I was, all right, keep talking. Oh, got it.
Yeah. So, so there you can see, okay, so, you know, the numbers are small, but they're growing. They were only in the 200s when I signed up, but you can see, there's 837, 19 different community groups. We haven't yet signed up as a community, which I think we could, but you can click on sign the Brit Hazon. And then if you scroll down a little, Vanessa, and, you know, here's what you're committing to do. Make a change in your own behavior, give time and money, raise your voice, right? And if you hit any one of those three, it will take you to another page and show you things that you can do. And, you know, so it's a very good sort of, you know, here you go. And if you hit any one of those things, it will tell you more about how to do that, right? So I think it's a very well constructed piece of work, and I highly recommend to you that you sign the Brit Hazon. Again, they're not asking us to complete the work, but just to do teshuvah, to change, to make something different, whether it's consume less meat or do more composting or whatever, you know, right? Everything counts, but the more we do, the better. So thank you very much. It's nice to be with you guys.
Thank
was
you, everybody.
I love that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you.
night.
Be well,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Happy
you.
New Year.
Bye.
These days.